So I'm going to talk about groups. I'm going to talk about groups because one of the challenges is, we all know this, is how do we move people from association, which I just showed you. These are people who are associated with certain religious groupings, to actually participation. And, people use this in pithy ways. How do we move people from sitting in rows to sitting in circles? I will tell you, as a researcher, we ask good, hard questions about that. But as a pastor, I started a church 2 years ago. I serve as the lead pastor. I'm a volunteer. I'm unpaid. But I preach there 3 to 4 weeks. I work with the staff. We planted this church. It's not a big church. I guess we had 350 or so Sunday. Our biggest challenge right now is how do we get people into groups? And I guess that's a recurring theme. Now, why do we care? Because we think that biblical community in church takes place when people are in smaller contexts and communities. Now, I don't think it's hermeneutically responsible to say the temple from house to house is the equivalent of the church and life groups, but I do think that the needs that both represent a gathered time of worship and a smaller time of community is a normative expression in the New Testament church. We see Hebrews 3:13, encourage one another daily while it is still called today, so that none of you is hardened by sin's deception. I only do 3 things in my church because I've got this full-time job at Lifeway Research. I preach 3 to 4 Sundays, I meet with the staff, and I lead a small group at my home. Here's why I lead a small group at my home, because I need people in my life. I've had the privilege of baptizing 4 or 5 of my neighbors. I went there in my small group. I need people in my life, and I need to be in small community myself. You can't lead what you don't live. And so to recognize the necessity of that, I need it. Bonhoeffer reminds us of this. Let him who is not in community beware of being alone. In the community you were called, the call was not meant for you alone. In the community you were called, you bear the cross. You bear your cross, you struggle, you pray. And so this research is from a new book that we're publishing. It'll be out in January. This is the first time I presented this data, so hopefully it's encouraging to you. But we're going to look at some things. Eric Geiger and I co-authored this book. It's based on a huge Lifeway research project. Let me give you a quick overview of the methodology. The book actually have all the details of that. But we surveyed 1,000 Protestant pastors and 3,500 plus people who actually attend small, or people related to small group who attend a Protestant church. And then we look at those who are involved in some form of group and those who were not. And I will tell you, it's not particularly difficult for me to make the case that pastors need to encourage people to move from sitting in rows to sitting in circles when they see the numerical differences that are every one of these are statistically significant at the inferential level when we compare the 2,500 those who attend groups and the 1,000 who don't, or we actually break it down to those who are regularly attending groups to those who are not, and take a look at some of the differences between the two. Those who never attend, I intentionally make time in my schedule to fellowship and interact with other believers. We see very huge differences. Huge difference. If this was a vote, you could be elected king. If this was the majority and the minority party, you see, I intentionally spend time with other believers, right? So again, these are things though that are self-evident. Well, if you're not in groups, you're less likely to actually be in fellowship. That's self-evident. But I want you to notice, too, that twice the Bible engagement is evident in those who are actually involved in groups compared to those who are not involved in groups. Now, it's fascinating to me that how large this chasm can actually be. Sometimes it's a little less, but still statistically significant at the inferential level. I've developed significant relationships with people at my church. People attend at least 4 times a month, say they attend at least 4 times a month regularly, 90% of people have significant relationships. If I want to serve others, you want a church that's serving? What you'll find is that churches that are serving are filled with people who are actually in community. People often ask me, why is my church not engaged in mission? And I often say, because they're probably not engaged in community. How do you live out Hebrews 10:24, which says to provoke one another to love and good deeds, right? If we're provoking one another to love and good deeds, that's the King James Version right there, good enough for Jesus, good enough for us. If we're not provoking one another to love and good deeds, then where does that take place? It takes place in small community. Now, we looked at, and I don't have time to unpack all of that, we looked at comparisons. Are home groups more effective than classes that meet on Sunday morning? I will tell you that by far the largest percentage of churches in the United States that are engaged in groups ministry are doing it on Sunday mornings, by far. And I know that's not trendy, it's not hip. It's, and to be full disclosure, the church I plant, we have home groups. We just started a second campus, so we have a building now that a church closed down and gave us their facility. So we may start some classes beforehand, but we don't do that at this point, so my own bias is probably there. But notice the theme. I intentionally try to get to know new people at the church. It goes on and on and on. Throughout the day, I find myself thinking about biblical truth. It not only affects what they do, but how they think. They're thinking more deeply, more scripturally. Why? Because they're living in community, probably with people who are asking them hard questions. But also, it impacts their theology. If a person is sincerely seeking God and he or she can obtain eternal life through religions other than Christianity. It impacts their theology, and spiritual matters do not tend to come up as an normal part of conversation with Christians. We find that both how they think, how they act, all these things take place.